We're glad that you are joining us again as we consider municipal bond credit stresses, bankruptcies, and worse. With increasing concerns about municipal bond creditworthiness, we are continuing our series with Jim Spiotto of Chapman Strategic Advisors on municipal bond credit stresses. Jim, do you have an opinion about the need for increased financial transparency among issuers?
Paul, there's an old saying, sunlight is the best disinfectant. For investors in municipal bonds, it's important to them to know all the relevant factors that go into their investment decision so that they can make the right decision. From the borrower's perspective, there should be no surprises for the investor. They should know what the current status of all the open issues are. From the standpoint of questions which the municipal investor is going to ask, first they want to know, can the municipality go into a Chapter 9 bankruptcy proceeding? That is dependent upon whether or not the state has authorized it to file. As we mentioned in the prior session, there are 12 states that generally authorize their municipalities to file. There are another 12 states that say, municipality, you can file if you get approval from this state agency, from this state elected official, or through going through this process. 3 states have very limited to a specific type of irrigation district, special service district that could file, so it's very limited. Another 2 states provide that the municipality cannot file, they're basically prohibited. The remaining 21 states basically don't provide any authorization, and since there is no specific authorization at this time, the municipality can't file. But rather than having the municipal investor guess or try to come to the right conclusion, it'd be great to disclose the municipality can file bankruptcy and is authorized, or it has no authorization, or it's subject to these conditions. The second is, what's the source of payment? It should be very clear to the investor how they're going to be repaid. Is this coming from a dedicated revenue source? Is this subject to operation and maintenance costs? Is this subject to a first lien of some sort? What is the reasons why I will be paid, and what are the reasons why I won't be paid? And how assured is that payment, i.e., the feasibility of the project or the tax base that will be paying that credit? The next is, what type of structure do I have? Do I have a statutory lien? That means that under the statutes of that state, the municipality in issuing the bonds can assure the bondholder that they will have a lien from the inception of the issuance, and as a statutory lien, it is mandated so that it can't be taken away in bankruptcy. Do they have special revenues as defined in the bankruptcy code, so that pledge of revenue for payment of those bonds are not to be interfered with again, are to be unimpaired in bankruptcy? Are there other, and this is the real question that I sometimes, the detail is not there, are there other provisions in state constitution or the state statutes that say that we have a priority in payment for these bonds or no priority in payment? For example, California says that their GO bonds issued by the state are second priority to education from all the revenues of the state, making sure they get paid. Other states have other provisions, sometimes similar. Is there a provision in the state law that mandates appropriation? Many states provide for an appropriation either before the bonds come due, when the bonds come due, or if payment isn't made, they provide for a mandatory appropriation by the next dollars. And it's important to have that realization. Is there a provision in state law that says that there's a mandated set-aside? As we know in Illinois, there is a mandated set-aside of the dollars as they come in each month for debt for the GO bonds of the state will be set aside. And many states provide various ways of setting aside funds either on a monthly basis before the payment is due or shortly before the payment is due. And does that exist? Are there effective remedies? Have the courts of that state not interfered with the bondholders requesting mandamus, which is the writ that says I'm not paid, levy taxes to pay me because it is due? Or have they not affected it? Most states, virtually all states, provide for mandamus. But what are the remedies and how are they been enforced? Is there oversight by the state and an ability to help them either refund the bonds? Virtually all states provide for the ability to refund bonds. Is there a refinance authority? Are there provisions in state law that allows the states to ensure that if the municipality can't pay, they'll provide the funds or intercept the funds? As you know, the state distributable aid bonds issued by the Michigan Finance Authority in Detroit had a mandate that before the money ever went to Detroit, it was taken out by structure and paid. You have the unlimited tax GO bonds in California, whether they're issued by school districts, counties, or municipalities, that have a specific dedication of the flow of the levied and collected taxes directly to pay the bond trustee or to go into an account to pay it. And when you take all that into consideration, when all that is disclosed, and quite candidly, we can look at a lot of OSs today and we say to ourselves, we could do more, we could do better, we can make things clearer, we can make it easier for the investor. And I think going forward, that's what we ought to do to make sure that when the investor invests, they know precisely what they're getting.
Well, that was an articulate case for better transparency in terms of bankruptcy fundamentals and also security fundamentals for municipal bonds, which relates to disclosure of financial statement information. So I'm shifting gears slightly here. Do you favor more strict legislation regarding making financial statements available? And is it realistic for such legislation to be at the federal level?
Well, I think that the more uniformity among state and local government financial reporting, the better off we are. Obviously, GASB does a great job in trying to think through some of those issues. The GFOA has done, in a long-term basis, a great job in setting best practices. The same thing with the National League of Cities and other municipal finance entities. But I think to the degree that we can agree upon a template that everybody is using, it makes it easier to compare, it makes it easier for the investor to assess, and it is a better check and balance for the issuer to know where they are in relationship to everybody else. So I think the more that we can accomplish it. Now, I always have a problem when we say, should the federal government do something? You know, the old adage or joke, I'm here for the federal government to help you, sometimes is a source of laughter rather than comfort. And I think the federal government, as the co-sovereign with a state, has to be very careful to always treat the state and the local governments as co-sovereigns do. And there is a tendency, and I think that the SEC and the MSRB has tried to keep a good balance there, but the federal government should not interfere with the government and affairs of the state and the local governments. And so I hope the policy develops by best practice as opposed to regulation, which could put, because sometimes regulation is too hot or too cold and not just right, and therefore it won't fit the bill and may interfere with the government, state and local, doing what they have a right to do.
I remember the Tower Amendment, named for Senator Tower from Texas, a long time ago. Is that still relevant in terms of this issue of the authority of the federal government to mandate disclosure at the state and local government level?
I think it is relevant. I think the SEC and the MSRB obviously have their view that since it's interstate commerce and since it's securities sold to public throughout the United States, that they have a role in setting the right guidelines and regulations. And certainly there should be respect for that notion. At the same time, and this gets into issues like the tax exemption and the ability of states to issue tax-exempt bonds, I believe that when we put it into proper perspective, the role of the federal government is to protect interstate commerce, but not to interfere with the powers and ability of a state government and a local government to deal with its affairs, borrow money as they believe necessary to deal with its essential services and infrastructure. And when you do that, I think that actually Baker versus South Carolina, which was really presented to the court not on a tax-exempt basis, but presented on whether or not they could impose a registration requirement on bearer bonds on an interstate basis as opposed to intrastate. And clearly the federal government should have that power. I don't think that they can basically penalize by federal taxes the ability to borrow by state and local governments. And I think, as Justice O'Connor said in Baker versus South Carolina, that was a bridge too far, and that unfortunately our Supreme Court, and I am loath to ever criticize the Supreme Court, but I think they went beyond what they needed to in that situation. And people have read it as undoing the precedent that we had in the 1800s, that tax exemption of state and local debt should be there forever. And just to take this tangent one step further, which people may care about, when income tax came about in 1913 and through 1916, and we needed to obtain the approval of 2/3 of the states to do so. The last state was New York, as you probably know. And Governor Hughes of New York said he thought the notion of the ability to tax revenue or income from any source was not properly written because it could include the payment of interest by state and local governments on their bonds. And the House and the Senate rose up on the floor to say, oh no, we don't intend that. And the basic predecessors to 103 that we have today was written right into the regulations going in thereafter, after they adopted the amendment and after Governor Hughes and everyone else went along with their statement that we did not intend that taxing income from whatever source meant interest on state and local government bonds. And it's for that reason that, and ever since then, when we had World War I and we needed more revenue back in 1920 and 21, we revisited, why don't we start taxing state and local government debt? Beaten down then. We tried it during the Depression. It was beaten down. And now we have the same efforts. And I think we really have to put our state and federal government relationships in the right perspective.
Well, those were good comments on tax exemption. And if I may go back to the Tower Amendment, the purpose of that, as I understand it, was to protect states and local governments from the reach of Washington in terms of mandating certain kinds of disclosure.
Right.
So are you saying that amendment still has some life in it?
I believe if you put it in the proper focus, given the history I mentioned with regard to co-sovereigns, the state and local governments are not a sub-sovereign, and as co-sovereigns, you can help them do the right thing, but you can't tell them what to do. And I think under that vein, you can certainly make sure that disclosure takes care of the anti-fraud elements, which is what the SEC and MSRB, without asking them to do things that aren't within the province of one co-sovereign talking to another co-sovereign, including, I would throw into that, interfering with the ability to issue bonds by increasing the cost by doing away with the tax exemption.
Good. Jim, in a talk at the most recent Investor Tools User Forum, and thank you for being one of our speakers.
My pleasure.
You commented on willingness to pay, and you suggested that it was possibly an increasing problem. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, for one thing, at least historically, we sort of understood, and it's the reason why municipal bonds have such a low default rate. It's the reason why state governments have not defaulted on GOs since the late 1800s, with the exception of Arkansas in 1930s, where they quickly refinanced it. The reason is state and local governments need the ability to borrow and access to the market and borrow at a low cost, because that's how we provide our essential governmental services. That's how we improve our infrastructure. That's how we made this country, with the roads, sewer systems, and improvements it's have, what it is. At the same time, when we look historically, what happened in the 1840s when we had 8 states and 1 territory repudiate their debt because of the downturn of 1839 and other economic factors? They soon found, whether they were in the North or the South, that their ability to borrow at a low cost went away. The yield, when Indiana and Illinois, which were 2 of the states that went to borrow to complete their construction projects on transportation systems that they mightily needed to grow their state, their yield went up to over 32% per annum. Obviously not sustainable and affordable. And so they soon, along with 7 other states, repudiated their repudiation, so to speak, and repaid their bonds and became good borrowers in that sense. The 2, Mississippi and the territory of Florida, which didn't, wound up being shut out of the market for a long period of time. Florida took more than a decade and statehood to bring them back into acceptable market status. And so that lesson was learned. It came again in the 1800s, the late 1800s, when we issued, including like the railroad bonds, where state and local governments, as I mentioned before, issued bonds for non-essential governmental services, i.e., I want a railroad station and I want a railroad to come to my town, so I'm going to build it. Or some of them borrowed money to invest in the railroads so that as stock owners, they could try to tell them, we want you to come to our community. And then they tried to tell the bondholders, well, it didn't work, so we ain't going to pay you. Now, that is a real willingness to pay problem. And there were over 300 cases between 1865 and 1895 that went up to the U.S. Supreme Court. And the U.S. Supreme Court was unanimous. If you issue bonds as a moral obligation, as they started, which then became a legal obligation, you have to pay those bonds. You represented it was valid, legal, binding, and enforceable, and you now must live with what you did. So I think that the willingness to pay historically has been beaten back by the consequences suffered. We now have sort of a new testing of the principle, and I don't think anyone believes that Detroit going through what they went through was a pleasurable, easy, desirable situation. And I don't think Chapter 9 is ever intended to be. It's uncertain, difficult, expensive, and painful. And so therefore, the willingness to pay hopefully will not be a problem, because if it is, that which helped make the U.S. both by infrastructure, by economy, that which it is, won't be there, i.e. state and local government financing. Any local community can decide what they want to build, when they want to build it, and finance it locally. In all our other countries, if you look at throughout the world, they do not have that ability. And that ability has helped make the United States what it is. The recent outbreak in Ukraine, one of the things that they now have on the table is they want regional autonomy so that they don't have to go to the central government to borrow money. Sounds interesting, but here in the United States, it sounds like a foreign issue. And so I think we have to appreciate what we have, which is a great structure, a great means of financing, a great means of allowing us to make our decisions locally, and I don't think we should want to depart from that.
So the traditional governmental principle in the U.S. of priority of repaying debt or treating that debt as sacred it sounds very strong, and you've given a good historical overview. You touched briefly on the fact that today there's a reassessment of that principle. And it seems to me that in some cases, hopefully limited cases, but there is an increasing attitude of what can we get by with not paying, as it used to be in some of the states that you referred to. I hope that doesn't continue.
Well, I think that how did we as children, Paul, recognize that the stove was hot? We either had a sibling burn their hand and say, that doesn't appear to be a bright idea, or we did it ourselves. I think you look at Detroit. Detroit tried to say that the unlimited tax GOs, the bondholders shouldn't be paid, they should be treated as unsecured debt. And now they're going to get 100 cents on the dollar. The bond insurers made a deal and they get 74 cents on the dollar. They're presently in the Detroit litigation, the question of the cops, the certificates of participation, and whether or not, because they had a bad mayor and a bad administration, whether that was a valid and binding obligation. Well, they represented to the market it was a valid and binding obligation. And in the spirit of George Washington and Alexander Hamilton and all of the people who have come before them, I think they have to realize that if they go out to the market and represent, it's valid, binding, and enforceable. The word is their bond. To take away and not live up to that will only increase the risk, which increases the cost, which limits their ability to access the market. That's the worst thing for Detroit, because they need to reinvest in Detroit and build Detroit, which will mean they have to go back to the market and borrow.
Jim, are there any municipal bond sectors that you see as particularly vulnerable to financial stress? And then as a counterpoint, do you see any other sectors that have unappreciated elements of strength?
Yes, Paul. First of all, healthcare, housing, real estate-related bonds, whether they've been rated or unrated, have generally been an area of economic dynamic uncertainty. And because of that, you have to look to the feasibility study, to the demographics, to the economics of each transaction, and you have to realize there are risks there. The high-yield bond sector is there because there are risks. As I said, essential governmental services, traditional GO and revenue bond financing has a significantly lower default rate, and it is tied to the essential nature of governmental services and the need to fund that. And as we have talked about, the willingness to pay should not be an issue. Hasn't in the past, for the most part, shouldn't in the future. With regard to sort of the unappreciated value in some of these, clearly, whenever you have a little uncertainty in the market, such as questioning unlimited tax GO bonds in Detroit, occasionally that contagion in people say, and people in other parts of the country were concerned that they were paying more for their unlimited tax GOs, for example, in California, where they have a voter-assisted GO that has an unlimited tax pledge, that has collected by the county treasurer. That money, whether it's from a city or county GO or a school GO, goes directly into an account for the bondholders or goes directly to the trustee. They were really never at risk. The Chapter 9s from San Jose School District to Sierra King Healthcare District and others, including the water and sewer bonds in Vallejo and in Stockton, they've been paid in full. They've been paid on time. There have been no interruptions during the Chapter 9. They were always intended to be unimpaired. So I think there are, unfortunately, in times where people see more filings, such as with Detroit, or a larger filing such as Detroit, there's some uncertainty. I think we need to quell that uncertainty, and there's some real value in some of those dedicated, strong structures that are more than sufficient to make sure their payment, and that can be either an unlimited tax GO or a revenue bond that has an enterprise that is more than sufficient long term to make the payments, that you shouldn't have any fears or concerns, and more likely than not, the spread between them and other credits are not wide enough, and that somebody in that spread is underpaying for the risk, and some people are overpaying for the risk.
Your perspective is very valuable, Jim. Thank you. And for those of you that have enjoyed this session and find it of value, as I have, come back for part 3.